In the far north of Europe, land of snow and mountains, lived the Vikings, brave and adventurous. Over 1,000 years ago, these explorers and warriors made the seas their roads, traveling to places far and wide, their stories filled with exciting adventures and mysterious tales. Imagine being a Viking sailing across vast oceans in longships, discovering new lands and trading treasures from distant corners of the world. Their lives were not just about battles, they were skilled farmers, crafters, and traders too. Join us on this exciting adventure as we bring the Viking world to life, uncovering secrets and stories that show how they changed the world and why they are remembered today. First of all, who are Vikings? Originally hailing from Scandinavia, now known as Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, the Vikings were seafaring people who between the late 8th and late 11th centuries engaged in raiding, trading, pirating, and settling across Europe. Their expeditions reached as far as the Mediterranean, North Africa, the Middle East, Greenland, and Vinland, which is today's Newfoundland in Canada. This era, often referred to as the Viking Age, not only marks the Vikings' activities abroad, but also includes the residents of the Scandinavian homelands. Their influence was significant in shaping the medieval history of regions like Scandinavia, the British Isles, France, Estonia, and Kievan Rus. Renowned for their exceptional skills in sailing and navigation, the Vikings, aboard their iconic longships, founded Norse settlements and established governance in areas including the British Isles, the Faroe Islands, Iceland, Greenland, Normandy, and the Baltic coast. Their ventures extended through the trade routes of the Dnieper and Volga in what is now Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, where they were known as Varangians. Notably, the Vikings' lineage gave rise to the Normans, Norse Gaels, Rus people, Faroes, and Icelanders. Their adventurous spirit even led them to serve as the Byzantine emperor's bodyguards before attacking Constantinople. Their travels took them as far as Iran and Arabia, and they were the first Europeans to set foot in North America, with a brief settlement in Newfoundland, also known as Vinland. Through their journeys, they not only spread Norse culture, but also integrated foreign elements, slaves, and concubines into Scandinavian society, thereby influencing its genetic and historical landscape. Over time, the Norse territories evolved from fragmented kingdoms into the consolidated nations of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. The Vikings communicated in Old Norse and used runes for inscriptions. Initially followers of the Old Norse religion, they later embraced Christianity. They had a distinct legal system, art and architecture, and primarily lived as farmers, fishermen, craftsmen, and traders. The common image of Vikings as either barbaric raiders or heroic explorers has been shaped by centuries of mythology, beginning with the 18th century Romanticization and further evolving during the 19th century Viking revival. These perceptions have contributed to modern stereotypes that often distort the true nature of the sophisticated Norse society revealed by archaeology and historical records. For instance, the iconic horned helmets often associated with Vikings are a myth from the 19th century and are not supported by historical evidence. Let's look briefly into the etymology and original meaning of Viking. The term Viking encapsulates three distinct aspects: its etymological roots, its use during the medieval period, and how it is understood today. One perspective holds that Viking originates from the Old English term Wising, predating the term by nearly 3 centuries. These are thought to stem from Wic, similar to the Latin vicus, implying village or settlement. A less favored hypothesis posits that Viking may have evolved from the feminine vik, meaning a creek or small bay. The suggestion that Viking comes from the historical Norwegian district Viken, meaning an individual from this region, has been proposed, although Old Norse texts refer to these individuals as Vikvarir rather than Viking. A more linguistically supported theory from the early 21st century links Viking to the Old Norse Vika, meaning sea mile, which refers to the distance covered between rowing shifts. This idea, supported by Bernard Mace, traces back to a Proto-Germanic root, suggesting that the term predates the adoption of sailing among northwestern European Germanic tribes. In this view, the feminine Viking might have initially referred to a lengthy sea voyage marked by rower shifts, with a Vikinger being a participant in such voyages. The term Viking may not have initially been linked to Scandinavian mariners, but acquired this association as they began to dominate maritime activities. During the Middle Ages, Viking became synonymous with Scandinavian pirates or raiders. The earliest English citation of Wreaking dated around 700, translating to piraticum, or pirate. The first recorded Viking raid in England at Lindisfarne occurred approximately 93 years later. In Old English literature, such as the 9th century poem Vidsith, Wreaking appears but is not tied to nationality, with terms like Northmen and Dene, meaning Danes, used for that purpose. In Asser's The Life of King Alfred, the Danes are labelled as pagans, a term sometimes equated with Vikings in translations, though this is contested by scholars who argue for more nuanced interpretations. Notably, Wreaking does not appear in surviving Middle English documents. The period known as the Viking Age in Scandinavian history stretches from the first recorded Norsemen raids in 793 to the Norman conquest of England in 1066. During this time, Vikings navigated the Norwegian and Baltic seas to venture southward. Descendants of Vikings, known as Normans, were granted feudal control over areas in northern France, like the Duchy of Normandy in the 10th century, illustrating the Vikings' lasting influence in northern Europe. King Harold Godwinson, England's final Anglo-Saxon monarch, boasted Danish ancestry. Vikings also ascended to the English throne, with Swene Forkbeard ruling in 1013 to 1014, and his son Canute the Great from 1016 to 1035. The Viking Age encompassed Scandinavian territories, modern-day Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, and extended to North Germanic-dominated areas like the Danelaw, which included Scandinavian York, the remnants of Northumbria, parts of Mercia, and East Anglia. Viking navigators also ventured to the Shetland, Orkney, and Faroe Islands, Iceland, Greenland, and even established a brief settlement in Newfoundland around 1000. The Greenland settlement, founded around 980 during the medieval warm period, saw its decline by the mid-15th century, partially due to climate change. Vikings, forming the Runic dynasty, dominated Eastern European territories, making Kiev the capital of the Kievan Rus in 882. By 839, Swedish emissaries visited Byzantium, marking the beginning of Scandinavian service as mercenaries in the Byzantine Empire. The 10th century saw the formation of the Varangian Guard, composed mainly of Scandinavians. The term Varangian likely derived from Old Norse, but in Slavic and Greek, it referred to Scandinavians or Franks. A significant number of Swedish men joined the Varangian Guard, leading to a law in Vasta Gotland to prevent inheritance claims by those who migrated to Greece, the term used for the Byzantine Empire. Archaeological findings indicate Viking presence in Baghdad, the Islamic Empire's hub. The Norse traded goods like furs, tusks, and slaves along the Volga River. Key trading locations during this era included also other big cities. Scandinavian Vikings explored Europe via its seas and rivers, engaging in trade, raids, colonization, and conquest. This era saw Norsemen from Denmark, Norway, and Sweden establish settlements in locations like the Faroe Islands, Iceland, Greenland, Newfoundland, the Netherlands, Germany, Normandy, Italy, the British Isles, the Baltic region, and parts of Eastern Europe, influencing the formation of modern Scandinavian countries. In the Viking Age, modern nations like Norway, Sweden, and Denmark were not yet formed, with the region's inhabitants sharing cultural and linguistic similarities. Scandinavian kings' names are only well documented in the later Viking Age. Post-Viking Age, the distinct national identities and Christianization of these territories marked the beginning of their respective Middle Ages. The relationship between Slavic and Viking tribes was complex, characterized by conflict, intermingling, and trade. The Middle Ages saw significant exchanges from Slavic regions to Scandinavia, with Denmark being a fusion of Slavic and Scandinavian elements. Recent scholarship emphasizes the substantial Slavic influence in Scandinavia. For example, a 10th century grave in Denmark, initially identified as Viking, is now thought to belong to a Slavic woman from present-day Poland. Connections between early Swedish royalty and the Slavic world further illustrate the intertwined histories of these cultures. Norwegian Vikings initiated the colonization of Iceland in the 9th century. The first records of Iceland and Greenland date back to a papal letter from 1053, and Adam of Bremen mentioned them in his Gesta about 20 years later. It wasn't until after 1130, once these islands were Christianized, that their histories began to be documented from the perspective of the locals in various sagas and chronicles. Vikings ventured into the northern Atlantic islands and coasts, south to North Africa, east to Kievan Rus, Constantinople, and the Middle East, engaging in raiding, trading, serving as mercenaries, and establishing settlements. Initially, Vikings returned home following their raids, but over time they started to establish permanent settlements abroad. Led by Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, they reached North America, founding short-lived settlements in what is now Newfoundland, Canada, during the medieval warm period. The Vikings' expansion into continental Europe faced limitations due to the powerful tribes to the south, including the Saxons in Old Saxony, now northern Germany, who frequently clashed with the Vikings. To counteract Saxon pressure and fortify their position, the Danes built the massive Danevirke fortification around Hedeby. The Vikings observed Charlemagne's conquest of the Saxons during the Saxon Wars, which led to the integration of Old Saxony into the Carolingian Empire and prompted the Vikings to enhance Danevirke's defenses. These fortifications remained in use well into the post-Viking Age, until 1864. In 808 AD, under King Gudfred, Vikings conquered the Obertrite city of Runic in the southern Baltic and moved its merchants to Hedeby, asserting Viking dominance over the Baltic Sea for the duration of the Viking Age. Research by the University of Cambridge and the University of Copenhagen suggests that Viking might have evolved from an ethnic identity to a professional one in certain groups. Debates abound regarding the Vikings' expansion motives. Historian in the 11th century suggested that the quest for women might have driven Vikings to raid foreign lands. Adam of Bremen noted the polygynous practices of wealthy Viking men, possibly leading to a shortage of women for the average Viking male, pushing them to seek wealth and power to attract women. This concept, gaining attention centuries later, became a scholarly cliché, suggesting Vikings often married or enslaved foreign women as wives or concubines. This practice likely increased male competition, leading to risky behaviors aimed at elevating status and seeking sex. For instance, in 821, Vikings reportedly abducted numerous women from an Irish village. Another theory suggests that Charlemagne's forceful Christianization of pagans incited Viking resistance and retribution. Rudolf Simek notes the timing of early Viking activities coinciding with Charlemagne's reign. The spread of Christianity in Scandinavia, starting in the 10th century, sparked prolonged conflicts within Norway, not directly related to Charlemagne's actions, as Norway faced internal strife over Christianization through encounters with foreign cultures. The Vikings took advantage of weaknesses in surrounding areas, intensifying their raids following Charlemagne's death, which led to his empire fragmenting into weaker states. Viking attacks were not new, but their frequency and magnitude increased significantly during this period. England, with its internal divisions and accessible coastal towns, became an easy target. The absence of organized naval defense across Western Europe allowed Viking ships to move freely, raiding or trading as opportunities arose. Additionally, the decline of traditional trade routes following the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the expansion of Islam may have influenced Viking activities. Raids and settlements by Scandinavians were part of a broader pattern of migration and invasion in Europe, which had seen movements like those of the Jutes, Saxons, and Angles centuries before. The Viking raids stood out for their scale and the fact that they were documented by eyewitnesses. The Vikings themselves were expanding, driven by factors that are not entirely clear, but may include resource scarcity and limited mating opportunities. The advancements in their seafaring technology during the 9th century enabled them to travel further, reaching as far as Kievan Rus, Constantinople, and Baghdad. following what was known as the Highway of Slaves across the Baltic Sea. Jomsborg, a semi-legendary Viking stronghold on the southern coast of the Baltic Sea, existed from the 960 to 1043. The stronghold's exact location and even its existence remain uncertain, but it is often placed on the Oder estuary islands and was home to the Jomsvikings. As the Viking Age progressed, Scandinavia itself was undergoing significant cultural changes influenced by external interactions. The late 11th century saw the emergence of nation-states in Scandinavia, with royal dynasties legitimized by the Catholic Church, which had gained influence in the region. This period marked the development of towns as centers of secular and ecclesiastical administration and trade, with the emergence of monetary economies based on English and German models. The economic landscape also changed with the cessation of the influx of Islamic silver and the end of English silver flow by the mid-11th century. The integration of Christianity into Danish and Norwegian society was well underway by the 11th century, with the establishment of dioceses, while in Sweden, Christianity was beginning to organize and assert itself more effectively. The first archbishopric in Scandinavia was established in Lund, Scania, in 1103, signaling a deeper assimilation of Scandinavian kingdoms into European Christendom, altering the ambitions of Scandinavian rulers and their relations with neighbors. The Viking practice of taking slaves from European peoples was a major source of profit. However, as the medieval church's influence grew, the moral stance that Christians should not enslave fellow Christians led to a decline in chattel slavery across northern Europe, reducing the economic motivation for Viking raids. The practice of raiding in Christian lands around the North and Irish seas decreased significantly. Norwegian kings continued to assert power in parts of northern Britain and Ireland, and Scandinavian raiding persisted into the 12th century. However, the military ambitions of Scandinavian rulers began to diverge, with Sigurd Thunt of Norway participating in the Crusades to the eastern Mediterranean in 1107. Similarly, Danish and Swedish kings engaged in the Baltic Crusades during the 12th and 13th centuries, marking new directions in their military endeavors. Sources shedding light on Viking culture, activities, and beliefs are diverse. Vikings, primarily a non-literate society, left no extensive written records, but did use runes to inscribe their experiences on runestones. The majority of our detailed knowledge about Vikings comes from external cultures that interacted with them. Archaeological discoveries since the mid-20th century have provided a comprehensive view of Viking life, revealing details about their settlements, craftsmanship, naval technology, trade, and religious practices and artifacts, both pagan and Christian. In terms of literature and language, the most significant insights into Viking life come from contemporary writings from regions where Vikings were active. The introduction of Latin script came with Christianity to Scandinavia, leading to scarce native written records before the late 11th century. While rune inscriptions existed, they were often brief and formulaic. Many written sources from this era are external, produced by Christian and Islamic communities that experienced Viking raids. Subsequent historical records offer insights into Viking culture, but must be approached with caution. After Scandinavia's Christianization and integration into medieval Christian Europe, native documents began to surface in Latin and Old Norse. Notably, Iceland, a Viking settlement, produced a rich body of vernacular literature between the 12th and 14th centuries, including sagas that recorded Viking traditions. While these texts' historical accuracy is debated, they provide valuable information on Viking poetry, genealogy, self-perception, and moral values. Vikings indirectly left traces of their language and culture through place names and words in their former territories, many of which remain today, providing clues about their settlements and values. Examples of such place names include Egilsay, Ormskirk, Meals, Snæfell, Ravenskar, Vinland, Kaupanga, Torshavn, and Odense. Viking legacy also persists in modern institutions like the Tynwald on the Isle of Man. The Old Norse language of the Vikings has significantly influenced the English language, offering insights into their interactions with the British Isles peoples and cultures. In places like the Shetland and Orkney Isles, Old Norse completely supplanted local languages, eventually evolving into the extinct Norn language. Linguistic research, including studies of place names and personal names, continues to illuminate Viking culture and their interactions with other societies. Linguistic and etymological research remains crucial for understanding Viking social structures, history, and interactions with other cultures. The influence of Old Norse is evident in modern Scandinavian languages, though it had little impact on Slavic languages in Eastern Europe, possibly due to language differences, the peaceful nature of Viking activities there, and their numerical minority. While the Norse named some Dnieper rapids, these names have not significantly influenced modern terminology. During the Viking Age, Norse people were literate, using a non-standardized alphabet known as runor, based on sound values. Runic inscriptions, rather than paper writings, have predominantly survived, with thousands of stones discovered in Viking territories, often commemorating the deceased, but not exclusively placed at burial sites. The use of runes persisted alongside the Latin alphabet until the 15th century. Sweden houses the bulk of runic inscriptions from the Viking era, with many stones documenting the names of individuals involved in Viking raids. For example, the Kula runestone narrates extensive military campaigns in Western Europe, and the Turinga runestone describes a warband's exploits in Eastern Europe. Viking burial sites are widespread across Europe and their territories, including Scandinavia, the British Isles, Ireland, Greenland, Iceland, the Faroe Islands, Germany, Latvia, Estonia, Finland, Russia, and more. Their burial customs varied significantly, ranging from simple in-ground graves to elaborate tumuli and ship burials. Historical records suggest that many Viking funerals occurred at sea, with practices like burial or cremation varying by region. In what is now Sweden, cremation was the norm, whereas in Denmark, burial was more common, and in Norway, both methods were prevalent. Viking mounds, barrows, provide crucial insights into the Viking Age, revealing through the grave goods what Vikings valued for the afterlife. However, the specifics of Viking funerary rites for children remain unclear. Archaeological discoveries have unveiled a variety of Viking ships, showcasing the advanced craftsmanship involved in their construction. Among the diverse types of Viking ships, the longship stands out as the most recognized, primarily used for warfare and exploration. These vessels were designed for speed and agility, equipped with oars to ensure navigation, regardless of wind conditions. With their long, narrow hulls and shallow draft, longships could easily approach shores and deploy troops, making them vital for the Leidang, the naval defense fleets of Scandinavia. This adaptability is likely why longships are closely associated with the Viking image. Beyond the longship, Vikings constructed various watercraft for peaceful endeavors, such as the Nar, a cargo ship designed for transporting goods in bulk. Characterized by a wider hull, deeper draft, and fewer oars, Nars were mainly navigated in harbors and similar settings. A notable Viking innovation was the Betas, a spar that improved sailing efficiency, especially against the wind. It was customary for Viking sea vessels to tow or carry a smaller boat for moving crew and cargo to the shore. Viking ships were central to their society, enabling travel, exploration, raiding, conquest, and commerce, as well as holding significant religious value. High-status individuals were sometimes interred in ships with offerings like animals, weapons, and personal belongings, as seen in the Gokstad and Oseberg ship burials in Norway and the Ladby ship burial in Denmark. This burial practice extended beyond Scandinavia, as shown by the Salma ship finds in Estonia. In the late 1960s, the remains of 5 Viking ships were unearthed in Roskilde Fjord, representing both longships and gnars. These ships, scuttled in the 11th century to protect the then Danish capital of Roskilde from naval attacks, are exhibited at the Viking Ship Museum in Roskilde. Recent excavations in 2019 at Gamla Uppsala revealed 2 Viking boat graves, with one containing the remains of a man, a dog, and a horse, offering further insight into Viking burial practices and their cultural significance in that area. Viking society was structured into three main classes: thralls, carls, and jarls, as depicted in the Eddic poem Rigsthula. This poem narrates how the god Rig, also known as Heimdallr, fathered these classes, a social stratification supported by archaeological evidence. Thralls, the lowest class, were essentially slaves, constituting up to a quarter of the population. Essential for the Viking economy, thralls performed routine tasks, engaged in construction projects, and were a key element in trade, often being sold, particularly to Arab markets, in exchange for silver. Captured during raids or born into servitude, thralls were utilized in Scandinavia and new settlements for labor-intensive construction or sold as commodities. Carls, the free peasant class, owned land and livestock and managed agricultural and construction activities, relying on thralls for labor support. They represented the working free class, often referred to as bonder or freemen, and had roles similar to churls and huskarls in other societies. The jarls, forming the aristocracy, possessed wealth, extensive lands, and numerous thralls. They focused on governance, politics, hunting and sports, and maintained social networks through visits and expeditions. Jarls' funerals often involved sacrificial rites of their thralls, as evidenced by archaeological findings. The Viking social hierarchy was nuanced, with intermediate positions and some degree of mobility, indicated by titles such as Halder, Thane, and Landmand, bridging the carls and jarls. Viking social organization also included felag communities, which were associations in both civilian and military life. Members, known as felagi, might unite around a trade, shared ownership of a vessel, or military allegiance to a leader, with warriors referred to as drenge. Additionally, structured communities within towns and villages contributed to defense, religious practices, legal systems, and the assembly of things, underlining the complexity of Viking societal organization. In Viking society, as in much of medieval Europe, women were typically subordinate to their husbands and fathers, with limited political influence. However, historical texts depict Viking women as having a degree of independence and rights. They were notably freer than their contemporaries elsewhere. Free Viking women primarily served as housewives, with their societal status closely tied to their husbands. Marriage enhanced a woman's economic and social standing, earning her the title of husfreyja, or Lady of the House. Norse laws recognized her authority within the household. She was pivotal in managing the farm's resources, handling business, and rearing children, sharing some duties with her husband. Upon reaching 20, an unmarried woman, known as Maya or May, attained legal majority, gaining autonomy over her residence and legal status, though her marriage was typically arranged by her family. Marital arrangements involved the groom's family paying a bride price, while the bride contributed a dowry. Women had the right to divorce and remarry. Concubinage was present in Viking society, where a woman or frilla could cohabit and have children with a man without marrying, often being a mistress to a wealthy married man. While this provided a pathway for social advancement for the concubine and her family, her status was less stable than that of a wife. Children born within and outside of marriage had inheritance rights, though those born to married parents had preferable inheritance claims. Widows could inherit from their husbands, enjoying the same legal independence as unmarried women. The Viking inheritance system also allowed female relatives, such as paternal aunts, nieces, and granddaughters, to inherit property. In the absence of male heirs, a woman could inherit the family estate and leadership, becoming a baugreiger and maintaining all rights of the family head until she married. Viking women were involved in various societal roles, including religious functions as priestesses and oracles, and in the arts as poets and rune masters. They engaged in commerce and medicine, and might have participated in textile production and even military roles, as suggested by tales of shield maidens and archaeological discoveries like the berserker female Viking warrior. The liberties of Viking women gradually diminished with the advent of Christianity and were less mentioned in records by the late 13th century. Archaeological evidence suggests that Viking women generally lived longer lives, often beyond 35, a trend contrasting with earlier periods where many women died younger, likely due to childbirth complications. Studies of skeletal remains using anthropometric techniques indicate that Viking Age Scandinavian societies, particularly in rural areas, afforded relatively high status to women. This resulted in significant nutritional and health resources allocated to girls, contributing to their overall stronger and healthier constitution. Scandinavian Vikings bore a resemblance to today's Scandinavians, with fair skin and hair colors ranging from blonde to dark and reddish. Genetic analysis indicates that blonde hair was prevalent in eastern Sweden, whereas red hair was more common in western Scandinavia. Viking men typically wore their hair shoulder length and sported beards, with short hair usually seen only on slaves. Hair length varied based on personal preference and occupation, with warriors possibly opting for shorter styles for practicality. Some men, particularly in certain regions, bleached their hair to a golden saffron hue. Women also had long hair, worn loose or braided by the unmarried and typically styled in a bun by married women. The average heights were about 1.70 meters for men and 1.55 meters for women. Social classes in Viking society could be distinguished by their attire and grooming. Jarls, representing the upper class, were well groomed, displaying their status through luxurious clothing, including silk, and elaborate jewelry like brooches, belt buckles, necklaces, and arm rings, adhering to distinct Norse designs. Earrings were absent and finger rings rare, as they were considered Slavic. Carls, the free peasants, maintained good hygiene and style, albeit in a less extravagant manner. Archaeological evidence from Scandinavia and Viking settlements in the British Isles confirms the Vikings' attention to grooming and cleanliness. Graves often contained grooming tools like antler combs, indicating a widespread practice of personal care. These combs, common across various Viking settlements, including Dublin, Ireland, England, and Scotland, were intricately decorated with typical Viking art motifs. Found in both common and aristocratic graves, these combs suggest that hair grooming was a universal practice across all strata of Viking society. The sagas, along with archaeological findings like cesspits, kitchen middens, and garbage dumps, have provided comprehensive insights into the diet and cuisine of the Vikings. The undigested plant remains found in cesspits have been invaluable in understanding their dietary habits. Recent decades have seen increased archaeobotanical investigations, shedding light on the Vikings' agricultural and horticultural practices, and consequently, their diet. The Vikings' diet was diverse, including various meat products like cured, smoked, and whey-preserved meats, alongside sausages and fresh meat cuts prepared by boiling or frying. Their diet also comprised abundant seafood, bread, porridges, dairy products, vegetables, fruits, berries, and nuts. Alcoholic beverages consumed included beer, mead, and imported wines for the affluent. Seafood was a critical part of the diet, especially in coastal regions, with whale, walrus, and seal hunted extensively. Shellfish were consumed in large quantities, and fish like cod and salmon were staples, with herring being particularly important in the south. Dairy was consumed widely, with milk sourced from cows, goats, and sheep. Vikings produced fermented milk products, butter, and cheese. However, milk was not always readily available, even on farms. Vikings seasoned their food with both imported spices, like black pepper, and locally grown or wild harvested herbs, such as caraway, mustard, and horseradish. The Oseberg ship burial have provided evidence of these practices. Fruits, berries, and nuts were integral to the Viking diet, with finds of apples, plums, cherries, and various wild berries and nuts, including large quantities of hazelnut shells, indicating their consumption. Walnut shells found in places like Hedeby suggest their use for both dyeing and eating. Agricultural advancements like the moldboard plough allowed Vikings to cultivate even poor soils, with grains such as rye, barley, oats, and wheat being staples for porridge and bread. The exact methods of bread making are not entirely clear, but archaeological finds suggest they had the means to leaven bread. The quality of food varied, with common people often consuming wholemeal flour bread containing seeds of weeds like corn cockle, which is toxic and could cause illness. The Vikings actively engaged in and promoted various sports, many of which were designed to enhance combat skills and physical strength. Popular activities included spear and stone throwing, wrestling, known as glima, fist fighting, and stone lifting. Mountain climbing was common in hilly regions, while agility and balance were tested through running, jumping, and a unique sport that involved leaping between oars on the exterior of a ship's railing while it was rowed. Swimming was another favored sport, detailed by Snorri Sturluson, who describes diving, long-distance swimming, and a competitive form where two swimmers attempted to submerge each other. Children participated in these sports, and while women were known to swim, their involvement in competitive swimming remains unclear. King Olaf Tryggvason was renowned for his skills in mountain climbing and oar jumping, and he was also noted for his knife-juggling abilities. Winter sports like skiing and ice skating were crucial for transportation during snowy seasons and were also enjoyed recreationally. Horsefighting was another Viking sport, though its exact rules are not well documented. It typically involved two stallions competing in the presence of mares, often leading to fatal outcomes for one of the horses. In Iceland, a unique ball game known as natleik, akin to hockey, was played with a bat and a hard ball on ice. It was a vigorous game that could cause injuries and was popular among both adults and children, drawing large crowds, similar to horse-fighting events. Hunting was more of a sport than a necessity in Denmark, focusing on deer, hares, partridges, seabirds, and foxes, the latter both for pest control and their fur. Various hunting methods were employed, including stalking with spears, bows, crossbows, and using dogs, along with different types of snares and traps. Archaeological discoveries and historical texts reveal that Vikings engaged in social events and celebrations, enjoying board and dice games as a favored leisure activity. They crafted game boards from intricately carved wood, with pieces made primarily from wood, bone, or stone, and occasionally from more exotic materials like glass, amber, walrus tusk, and ivory. Among their games, the Vikings played various types of tafel games. Nefertafel holds the distinction of being one of the oldest board games played in medieval Scandinavia, its popularity extending through the Viking Age as they introduced the game to the British Isles. The runestone depicts what might be a scene of two individuals engaged in a Nefertafel, and sagas mention dice games often associated with gambling. Festive gatherings were characterized by the consumption of beer and mead, with entertainment provided through music, poetry recitals, and storytelling. Musical talent was highly esteemed, fitting the image of a cultured individual. Our understanding of Viking weaponry and armor comes from archaeological findings, artistic depictions, and Norse sagas and laws from the 13th century. Norse tradition mandated that all free men possess and bear arms, signifying their social status. A well-off Viking would typically own a complete set of arms, including a helmet, shield, mail shirt, and sword. However, swords were infrequently used in combat, likely due to their lack of durability, and served more as symbols or decorative items. The common freeman would likely use a spear and shield in battle, along with a seax, a type of knife, for utility, and as a secondary weapon. In early stages of combat and maritime warfare, bows were utilized, yet they were often seen as less honorable compared to close-range weapons. Vikings were notably distinct in their time for using axes. Viking warfare and aggression were partly driven by their Norse religious beliefs, with deities like Thor and Odin representing war and death. In modern culture, the Viking warrior is frequently depicted in a state of berserk rage, engaging in fierce combat. This portrayal is linked to the term berserker, which likely held different connotations in medieval Norse society. Theories suggest that such berserk states might have been induced by alcohol consumption or the use of psychoactive substances. However, These hypotheses are not strongly supported by saga literature or archaeological evidence. Vikings played a significant role in shaping the economic landscape of Europe and Scandinavia through their vast trading networks. Their influence extended far and wide, establishing critical trade centers such as Ribe and Hedeby in Denmark. Unlike other regions where coinage was common, Scandinavia's economy was largely based on bullion trade. The value of transactions was determined by the purity and weight of precious metals, primarily silver, though gold was also utilized. To facilitate trade, Vikings carried portable scales that allowed for the precise measurement of these metals, ensuring fair and accurate exchanges despite the absence of standardized coinage. This system underscored the sophistication of Viking trade practices and their adaptability to different economic systems encountered throughout their expansive trading routes. The Viking Age in England commenced dramatically on June 8, 793, with the Norsemen's assault on Lindisfarne Abbey, marking a pivotal moment that shook the royal courts of Europe and dramatically changed their perception of the Vikings. Northumbrian scholar expressed the unprecedented nature of the attack, highlighting the profound impact it had on contemporary European Christians. They perceived these incursions as divine retribution, lacking any other explanation for the Vikings' sudden appearance and the consequent suffering inflicted. The attack on Lindisfarne cast the Vikings in a negative light for centuries, with a significant reassessment of their legacy, acknowledging their craftsmanship, nautical skills, and technological prowess only beginning in the 1890s. Scandinavian culture and religion, as depicted through Norse mythology, sagas, and literature, provide a narrative of heroic and mythological figures, initially preserved orally before being transcribed by Christian scholars. The 200-year span of Viking influence on European history, predominantly narrated through the lens of Western European witnesses and their descendants, is replete with stories of raids and colonization. That was medieval perceptions of Vikings. Now let's dive into post-medieval perceptions. Publications regarding Viking culture began to emerge in the 16th century. The 17th century saw an increase in such publications. In the 17th century, Scandinavian scholars delved into runic inscriptions and Icelandic sagas for historical insights. In Britain, George Hicks marked a significant contribution to Viking studies. The 18th century witnessed a surge in British interest in Icelandic and early Scandinavian culture, leading to English translations of Old Norse texts and the creation of poems celebrating Viking heritage. The term Viking gained popularity in the early 19th century through Erik Gustaf Geijer's poem The Viking, promoting a romanticized view of Vikings that was historically inaccurate. The late 18th and 19th centuries Viking revival saw a burgeoning interest in Viking history, leading to archaeological explorations and linguistic studies that highlighted the Vikings' influence on contemporary culture and language. Historical understanding of the Viking Age was traditionally based on Icelandic sagas. However, modern historians increasingly rely on archaeology and numismatics, which have contributed significantly to a nuanced comprehension of the Viking era, moving away from solely literary sources to more empirical evidence. In modern popular culture, the Romantic Viking revival has significantly influenced creative works across various media. This influence spans historical novels and extends to historical fantasies and films. In the realm of comics, the Marvel Comics superhero Thor draws directly from Norse mythology. The historical drama series Vikings, though loosely based on historical events, mainly draws from literary sources and Norse poetry, blending historical elements with fiction. Video games also extensively feature Viking themes, exploring various facets of Viking lore and mythology. The fascination with Viking mythology continues in contemporary culture, influencing genres such as Viking metal in music, and is a popular theme in historical reenactment, with groups striving for greater historical accuracy over time. The cultural impact of Vikings extends into sports, with the naming of the Minnesota Vikings in the National Football League, reflecting the significant Scandinavian heritage in Minnesota, demonstrating the enduring legacy and fascination with Viking culture and history in modern times. Let's dive into common misconceptions about Vikings. The iconic image of Vikings wearing horned helmets is largely a myth, with no substantial historical evidence supporting the use of such helmets in battle by Viking warriors. The notion of horned helmets is contradicted by practical considerations, as the close-quarters combat style of Viking warfare, characterized by shield walls or combat on ships, would have rendered horned helmets impractical and dangerous to allies. Historical analysis suggests that horned helmets might have had a ceremonial role in Scandinavian culture, if they were used at all, but this has not been conclusively proven. The myth of Viking warriors donning horned helmets was largely propagated in the 19th century. It were intent on promoting Norse mythology as a source of artistic inspiration and cultural pride. Vikings were also artistically represented with winged helmets and attire reminiscent of classical antiquity, linking them to the revered classical past and lending an air of legitimacy and nobility to Viking history and mythology. In popular culture, from cartoons to sports teams like the Minnesota Vikings and Canberra Raiders, the horned helmet has become a staple, albeit inaccurate, symbol of Viking identity. Authentic Viking helmets were conical, crafted from hard leather with wooden and metal reinforcements, with more elaborate versions for chieftains, resembling earlier Vendel Age helmets. Additionally, the portrayal of Vikings as unkempt barbarians is a skewed view, with biased reports like those of Adam of Bremen, contributing to the exaggerated tales of Viking brutality and hygiene. The claim that Vikings used the skulls of enemies as drinking vessels is another myth, originating from a misinterpretation of the skaldic poem, which metaphorically described drinking horns as branches of skulls, but was mistranslated in the 17th century to suggest literal human skulls were used for drinking. As we sail back to the present from the adventurous seas of the Vikings, we carry with us tales of courage, discovery, and innovation that shaped the world. These legendary warriors and explorers were more than just fierce fighters. They were also skilled craftsmen, shrewd traders, and curious adventurers whose impact goes beyond the ancient sagas. Their influence is still seen today in our maps, languages, and even in the way we tell stories of heroes and exploration. The Vikings' journey through history teaches us about bravery, ingenuity, and the importance of exploring the unknown. Their legacy lives on, inspiring us to discover, learn, and grow. Thank you for joining us on this extraordinary journey through the Viking Age. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button. Remember, history is not just about the past. It's a light that guides us to the future. Stay curious, keep exploring, and who knows what incredible stories we'll uncover next. Until our next adventure, keep the spirit of the Vikings alive in your quest for knowledge and discovery.